A look at the uranium-based ammo the U.S. is sending to Ukraine. Washington, AP. The U.S. on Wednesday announced it was sending depleted uranium anti-tank rounds to Ukraine, following Britain's lead in sending the controversial munitions to help Kyiv push through Russian lines in its grueling counteroffensive. The 120mm rounds will be used to arm the 31 M1A1 Abrams tanks the U.S. plans to deliver to Ukraine in the fall. Such armor-piercing rounds were developed by the U.S. during the Cold War to destroy Soviet tanks, including the same T-72 tanks that Ukraine now faces in its counteroffensive. Depleted uranium is a byproduct of the uranium enrichment process needed to create nuclear weapons. The rounds retain some radioactive properties, but they can't generate a nuclear reaction like a nuclear weapon would, RAND nuclear expert and policy researcher Edward Geist said. Time equals 400 ms greater than when Britain announced in March it was sending Ukraine the depleted uranium rounds. Russia falsely claimed they have nuclear components and warned that their use would open the door to further escalation. In the past, Russian President Vladimir Putin has suggested the war could escalate to nuclear weapons use. A look at depleted uranium ammunition. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky greets U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken before a meeting at Bankova in Kyiv, Ukraine, Wednesday, September 6, 2023. Brendan Smialowski, Pool via AP. What is depleted uranium? Time equals 400 ms greater than depleted uranium is a byproduct of the process to create the rarer, enriched uranium used in nuclear fuel and weapons. Although far less powerful than enriched uranium and incapable of generating a nuclear reaction, depleted uranium is extremely dense, more dense than lead, a quality that makes it highly attractive as a projectile. Time equals 400 ms greater than, it's so dense and it's got so much momentum that it just keeps going through the armor, and it heats it up so much that it catches on fire, Geist said. When fired, a depleted uranium munition becomes essentially an exotic metal dart fired at an extraordinarily high speed, RAND senior defense analyst Scott Boston said. In the 1970s, the U.S. Army began making armor-piercing rounds with depleted uranium and has since added it to composite tank armor to strengthen it. It also has added depleted uranium to the munitions fired by the Air Force's A-10 Close Air Support attack plane, known as the Tank Killer. The U.S. military is still developing depleted uranium munitions, notably the M829A4 armor-piercing round for the M1A2 Abrams main battle tank, Boston said. What has Russia said? In March, Putin warned that Moscow would respond accordingly, given that the collective West is starting to use weapons with a nuclear component, and Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said the munitions were a step toward accelerating escalation. Putin followed up several days later by saying Russia would respond to Britain's move by stationing tactical nuclear weapons in neighboring Belarus. Putin and the Belarusian president said in July that Russia had already shipped some of the weapons. There was no immediate reaction from the Kremlin to the U.S. announcement, which came late Wednesday during a visit to Kyiv by Secretary of State Antony Blinken. The Pentagon has defended the use of the munitions. The U.S. military has procured, stored, and used depleted uranium rounds for several decades, since these are a long-standing element of some conventional munitions, Pentagon spokesman Marine Corps Lieutenant Colonel Garen Garn said in a statement in March in response to a query from the Associated Press. The rounds have saved the lives of many service members in combat, Garn said, adding that other countries have long possessed depleted uranium rounds as well, including Russia. Garn would not discuss whether the M1A1 tanks being readied for Ukraine would contain depleted uranium armor modifications, citing operational security. Not a bomb, but still a risk. Time equals 400 ms greater than. While depleted uranium munitions are not considered nuclear weapons, their emission of low levels of radiation has led the UN nuclear watchdog to urge caution when handling and warn of the possible dangers of exposure. The handling of such ammunition should be kept to a minimum and protective apparel, gloves, should be worn, the International Atomic Energy Agency cautions, adding that a public information campaign may, therefore, be required to ensure that people avoid handling the projectiles. This should form part of any risk assessment, and such precautions should depend on the scope and number of ammunitions used in an area. Time equals 400 ms, greater than. The IAEA notes that depleted uranium is mainly a toxic chemical, as opposed to a radiation hazard. Particles in aerosols can be inhaled or ingested, and while most would be excreted again, some can enter the bloodstream and cause kidney damage. High concentrations in the kidney can cause damage. And, in extreme cases, renal failure, the IAEA says. The low-level radioactivity of a depleted uranium round is a bug, not a feature, of the munition, Geist said, and if the U.S. military could find another material with the same density but without the radioactivity, it would likely use that instead. Time equals 400 ms, greater than. Depleted uranium munitions, as well as depleted uranium-enhanced armor, were used by U.S. tanks in the 1991 Gulf War against Iraq's T-72 tanks and again in the invasion of Iraq in 2003, as well as in Serbia and in Kosovo. U.S. troops have questioned whether some of the ailments they now face were caused by inhaling or being exposed to fragments after a munition was fired or their tanks were struck, damaging uranium-enhanced armor. Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova recently claimed that the use of the munitions in Ukraine has already led to radioactive contamination, the state news agency TASS reported Wednesday. Time equals 400 ms, greater than. Associated Press writers Lolita C. Baldor and Amr Madani in Washington, Frank Jordans in Berlin and Menelaos Hadjikostas in Nicosia, Cyprus, contributed to this report. Follow the app's coverage of Russia's war in Ukraine at https://apnews.com/hub/Russia-Ukraine.